Things that got me thinking about this lesson and and doing something on this. Just our society today. Everybody has all these different views, and they're trying to shame you into, if you don't agree with my view, shame on you, kind of thing. And what I want you to think of a definition of a just society. What does that mean? What is a just society? Do you feel like America is one now? Or do you feel like maybe did America start as one and we're losing our path? You know, what do you think, Bob? Give me just a few word description of a just society. What comes to your mind?
Fairness and equality
Okay.
well, maybe not quite. That might not quite be the word I'm looking for. Maybe it is.
Okay. Fairness is the first word that came to your mind.
Yeah.
What's the first word that comes to your mind, Mike? Okay. Well, fair enough. I mean, but, do you feel like maybe America started out as more of a just society than we are today? Or do you think we've gotten better or worse? Or neither? Do you think it's kind of gone downhill a little, maybe? Well, I did look up some of these words, like just is in the Bible over 80 times, and it refers to generally like a just measure, a just weight, or a just man. It's not like just do this, like we would say it. When it's translated, it has a little bit more of a meaning behind it. Justice is in 28 verses. I was surprised. I thought that would be a lot more. And I found it interesting that of those 28, 19 of them, judgment and justice, are in the same verse. And that caught me off guard. I'm not totally shocked by it, but I was a little bit surprised to see it. Justify appears just about a dozen times, but that's more of, like it would say something like, he was willing to justify himself. I think that might have been the rich young ruler, but that was our, I will not justify the wicked. It's almost like you're trying to find a reason for your actions or somebody else's that may not have been just actions, or good actions. Now, judge or judged is well over 200 verses. And it's things like Moses sat and judged the people, the Lord's judged between me and me, thee and me, the act of judging or having been judged. Now, judgment and judgments, both singular and plural, well over 400 times. And it refers to things like a sentence of judgment. He stood before the congregation for judgment. They gave judgment upon him. Righteousness is almost 300. Upright, which is a word that ties in, is over 60. Uprightness. Altogether, these words that we would put together with just or justice are total over 1,000 times these are mentioned. So it's a pretty, not just an important topic, but one that is, I would call, continuous. And when we think about this, where did mishpat come from? When you look at the word or the words judgment or judgments in the Old Testament, almost half of them come from this word. And it is, if you look it up in Strong's Concordance, it'll say judgment, justice, or ordinance. And it really means there is everything from the act of deciding a case to legislation, a case or a cause, a sentence given to somebody, execution of judgment, time of judgment, justice or right, ordinance, decision, a right, privilege, or due in legal terms, when those words, right, privilege, and due in legal terms. And it means it's everything from a courtroom setting, but it goes all the way to what group of people didn't own land? It was the Levites. And they were to take care of the temple and those types of things. And the temple tax, or the tithe, as we would call it, was to pay for them. And that was their mishpat. That was their judgment. That was their due. That was their right to have that. And so the word can mean a lot of things. I almost skipped putting it in the lesson until after we talked, by the way, because I lost my Bible program, and kind of a long story, but I've been using some online helps and was having trouble with that word and sought help. But so to move on a little bit, I guess, we think about a just society and what it means to live in one, and we like to think we live in a just society. And I would, after Corey's lesson, or his sermon last week about apologetics, I got to thinking, humans have this concept that we want to live in a just society. We think things should be a certain way. And does this appear in nature? And how would an evolutionist tackle this? And I did discover, I did not read the book, I did discover a lady wrote a book called The Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. And some information that I looked at, it was actually some podcast I listened to on this subject where I got a lot of the thoughts and references and things that I looked up. They talked about this book, and this lady goes out to live in a small cabin by a creek for a long period of time just to be isolated, and she's going to sit and observe nature and see what's going on. And she had some big takeaways from the book, but one things was nature, this beautiful, idyllic, picturesque thing, was absolutely bloodthirsty and terrifying. Because we look at animals and we say there's no right and wrong or what they do. Animals don't. Does a fox do right or wrong? Does a rabbit do right or wrong? No. Nobody's going to sit and watch a bug or a fly or an ant and say that they're doing something wrong. They're just animals. It's nature, and they do what comes naturally to them. And she observed everything from how a praying mantis acts. They're pretty vicious little insects. And to watch that a young muskrat would eat its siblings. And most people would describe nature as being beautiful, and it is, but how we behave towards each other is not even closely related in our concepts of justiceness or straightness or how anything, it doesn't exist in nature. The things that we call fair and just and moral and good in our society and how we deal with each other don't exist naturally. And even, because things come to your mind like, what can a bird do wrong? And I recently seen an article about a bird called a cowbird. You ever heard of one? It is not well in Ohio. It's not well established, but it's a bird that lays their eggs in another bird's nest. And because they pick a bird, Mike's grinning. So somebody else is doing all the work here. So they lay their eggs in another bird's nest, and they get another bird to hatch them and care for their young, and their young grows faster than the young and they kick them out and they take over. And that's natural. It occurs in nature. I read other things about pandas. Everybody loves a panda, right? I mean, what can they do wrong? They almost always have twins, and they throw one away because they don't want to raise two. Now, they've got reasons for this about nutrition and food and their diet and all these things and why, but yeah, they throw one away. They pick one, evidently, they check them out, figure out which one they feel like has the best chance, and the other one gets pitched. And I was also surprised to learn because one of the most protective mothers I think of in nature is a bear. I mean, we've coined phrases after, what was a lady from Alaska that was the mama bear thing? She was so protective. She was a politician, Sarah Palin, I think, because they're so ferocious. If they only have one cub, if a black bear has one cub, they kill it. I don't know if they think one isn't worth the trouble. Maybe there's something wrong with one if they only have one. I don't know.
Chinese bear.
Could be it, yeah, that could be it. But I was surprised to learn those things. But these things, and by the way, I did Google and try to look up how an evolutionist would justify these things. They can't. They didn't even really try. Actually, most of the stuff that comes up is about, what's the guy down at the Ark? Canham, yeah. A lot of the stuff that came up was stuff that he had written. There was some other stuff that came up. There was one or two things on evolutionists that came up, and you read them, and they don't have at the end, they don't have a clue. They have theories, but they don't know why, what sets humans apart. They just say things like, we evolved, but nothing else has, But in our culture today, as we think about all this, justice is a very fashionable word. You turn on the TV and there's politicians that give speeches and wax poetic about justice, and they all claim to have justice on their side, and different governments claim this, and some would be viewed as good and some as bad. But most Western cultures have a Judeo-Christian background when it comes to their laws and their constitutions, what makes their government function. In America, we view justice in a few different ways. It could be retributive, you're punished. So if you do something wrong, you go to jail or whatever the punishment for that crime may be. Restorative, so if Bob steals $5, Bob has to pay $5 back and do whatever it is he's sentenced to. It could be merciful, where they give somebody a second chance, or they let somebody out of prison for good behavior, perhaps early, and they say this is justice. He did his time. He served his due. Or fairness. People want to say fairness, that everybody's treated equal. And there's a lot in the news about that today, that people don't feel like they are treated equal, and some people are treated better than others. And then we have one of my favorite forms of justice in America, and this is my sarcastic side showing, is advocacy or activism. And activism can be, you wonder how that ties in. It can be an advocacy. It can be a great thing. It honestly can. There are people that do this type of work that provide free legal counsel. People that are being treated unfairly, they rise to their cause, and rightfully so. We have a lot of activist judges. You see, and that's what to me is the unfortunate part, that you see things in the news a lot of times and it's like, that ain't gonna hold up. And it doesn't in the end. But the truth is, a great judge in a courtroom, a judge might be a wonderful guy. He might be the kind of guy you want over at your house for a barbecue, just a laugh a minute, full of fun, always got a witty comment, but that doesn't mean he's a good judge. And it doesn't mean that he's fulfilling his role properly, I will say. But, and I've talked about where do we get this? Our sense of justice, our sense of all of these things, and I was thinking back a long time ago. One of my kids looked me in the eye and said, "That's not fair." And it revolved around their sibling was getting something that they weren't getting. And they determined in their mind and approached me that that was not fair. And I may have marveled, I don't know, looking back. I could have, I'm not sure. But I remember, I never sat down with my kids. Did any of you ever sat down with your kids and said, I want to have let's talk about fairness for a little bit? Because I want to explain to you that if Susie gets to go here or Katie gets to do this, that you get to do it too, and that's called being fair. Did any of you ever once have sit down your kids and have to explain to them about what's fair?
When they were older, yeah.
When they were older?
When it came time for staying up later, being able to drive a car, being able to do more things than the second one was able to do because they were not that age. It's not fair that he gets to do all this.
Yeah, well, they approached you with it though. But I mean, but until that point, when they came up to it in their mind, you didn't have to sit down and tell them, hey, I mean, they came up with that on their own now. Yeah. It isn't like, parents don't have to explain. My point being is, parents don't have to explain to their children what is fair. They can come up with it quite readily on their own. And I don't think mine was that old. And it seems to me my response was something like, okay, the other one got spanked yesterday, you did not come here. Because that would be fair, right? There was a look involved. The conversation ended, as I remember that. But it is funny, that you don't have to teach people about it. And it just seems like it can be, now they gather it from what's going on around them or things like that. And there are things that people might look at and say, you're right, as kids get older, the older one gets to do things, the younger one cannot. And there is going to be a conversation, more than likely, because they're going to bring it up, that, the first time you let one stay up later than the other one or go somewhere, it ain't like you sat down with the other one first and said, hey, I'm going to let Dan do this, but you got to understand why this is fair. They came up with it on their own, that they questioned it. And but in our society today, in the modern West, we live, liberty and justice. Boy, people like to say that, and you can't argue with those words. Nobody's going to stand up and say liberty and justice is wrong. We're not going to try to refute that, usually in any way. But we have all these cultures in our society that I'm going to call them, and they focus with political viewpoints, I think, more than maybe we realize. And the first one would be a maximizing view, okay, is what I'm going to call it, a maximizing view. And that would be whatever would bring the greatest amount of good and reduce the greatest harm for the greatest number of people. Now, this sounds like a great theory. That the vast majority of people get this greater good, and what this is going to reduce this harm to the vast majority of people. And if that's your guide, you want to go in that direction, you might make life better for a very large segment of the population, for the majority of the people at least. But what the problem is with it, at the core of it, it doesn't help you determine what is the greatest good. See, people think they know what the greatest good is, but that can get fuzzy along the way somewhere. And on the other side of that, what defines harm? What in our society is going to harm you? And there's lots of people that have lots of opinions on what is good for you and what is bad for you. And just look around. The big thing right now is the COVID vaccine. A lot of people think that, you should have it. If you don't, you're going to die. And maybe that's true. And a lot of people think that if you're going to get it, you don't know what side effects it's going to cause because they haven't done any testing on it. They don't know what's in it. They've never made a vaccine like this before. And there's arguments to be weighed on both sides. And in the end, for now, you're allowed to make that opinion on your own and make your own judgment and do as you see best for yourself. And people have, again, deeply held opinions about it, and I wouldn't say right or wrong either way. You got to go with what you believe to be best for yourself. This idea of maximizing, or it's a very broad brushstroke, and we would most define it in a socialism type of view today. It would be, there are political people you can watch in the news, and it don't take long to figure out who they are, that would say this is the way we ought to go. And this view would be most generally tied to socialism. Now the second,
Can I say something?
yeah, sure.
I can't remember the title of the book, but it was John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, the something letters when they wrote to substantiate why we needed to be a United States instead of a Confederates. And they brought up that point. If you do maximizing, you have a democracy. And they were afraid of different parts of the country experience different things differently. Somebody in New York City isn't going to experience the same thing somebody in Des Moines, Iowa is going to experience.
Very true.
And so you can't have one dictating the other purely by numbers. You need representation so that everybody's opinion is represented equally, because New York City, Los Angeles, California are different than Ashland, Ohio. And therefore the maximizing, even though those two cream us population-wise, they don't know necessarily what's best for us here. And therefore they set it up as this representative government so that we would not be, people won't be overrun.
It's absolutely correct, which is
By the numbers.
the difference between, so the United States, people say, is a democracy, and it's actually an incorrect statement. We have democratic elections, which means the popular view wins. Anybody outside, obviously you know, does anybody else know the difference between a democracy and a republic? The United States is a republic. Does anybody know what the difference is? In a republic, you cannot do something for the greater good that will harm the few. The rights of the minority are just as important as the rights of the many. And it's supposed to be everybody. That is why in our government, yes, we have the House of Representatives, which is based on population, and there are hundreds of members there, but every state has 2 senators, and everybody tells you the power lies in the Senate. So it doesn't matter if you are, who has the lowest population of a state, maybe Montana? Yeah, Montana has, I don't know, 100,000 people live there or something. It's pretty vague. Alaska too is huge and doesn't have very many.
750,000.
Okay, so they have just as many senators as New York or California, which one of those two I'm sure has, probably New York or California has the highest population. And there are people that think that's wrong. By the way, states used to be set up that way, and there was a lawsuit and it got overturned. I read. It was on the internet, it must be true. But years ago. But that is a different, now the second view, I'm gonna call it the freedom view, okay? And this would be about individual liberty, okay? Justice, which creates amount of respect for the rights and freedoms of the individual and how they want to live. And this is very deep-rooted in American culture. It really hums around that "don't tread on me" flag. You know, everybody I think has seen that. The guy down the road's got one flying on his flagpole. And it is a society that would accommodate and adapt to promote the fair treatment and equal liberties of every single person. And this tends to, we don't talk about it much, you don't hear about it a lot, but there is a political party that is libertarian. And it doesn't mean liberal, but it doesn't mean conservative either. It is about the individual rights. And they would stick up for rights, I'm sure, that everybody in this room would be opposed to, and some that they would be in favor of in both directions. But it would be viewed as libertarianism. And probably, I think if this got more press, more Americans would probably be in line with this than maybe some of the other two political parties. They probably, both Republicans and Democrats, probably fear this becoming mainstream. And the last one would be promoting virtue. And this would hum around, it would be a society that people would act in accordance to a moral virtue or moral code. This would be a vision of how people should act and behave, and there would be a moral compass involved that would point people in a direction that would attain a certain level of virtue or integrity, and a just society in their point of view would push people in this, and this is political conservatism. And that would be a little bit more in line with the Republican Party. But the point, I guess, I want to make in telling you about all these different political views, or the three different political views that seem to be mainstream in America, and I'm sure you could find other points that other people have that are far off of this, but they're probably the main views. And they all use words like justice, fairness, and they would just have drastically different meanings. But they all have the same vocabulary. And it sounds almost like a joke, but you put a liberal socialist, a libertarian, and a conservative in the same room, and you get Congress, okay? And, but you put all these people in the same room, and we have that in Washington, and they're all using words like justice and judgment and law and order and what's the greater good for society, but they all have drastically different definitions of those words. So when you start to think about, do we live in a just society, or what is justice? I found a really good verse in Jeremiah. In chapter 9, and verses 23 and 24, thus saith the Lord, let not the wise man, let the wise man glory in his wisdom, neither let the mighty man glory in his might. Let not the rich man glory in his riches, but let them glory in this, he that understandeth and knoweth me, that I am the Lord, which exercises loving kindness, judgment, and righteousness in the earth. And for these things, in these things I delight, saith the Lord. So, a lot of our laws that we have in America definitely started off, if you read our old laws, our Constitution, we're in the last one of those. Okay, they framed a set of laws that was going to channel society to go in a certain direction. It would encourage people to live a certain way. There were punishments if you didn't. But what does, if we think about what does a biblical just society look like? And would that have context in our today's society? For instance, how was Israel's society based? What kind of society was it? What kind of economic system did they have? How did they function day to day? It mainly hovered around agriculture. When the Israelites went into the land, they were each, outside of the Levites, each tribe, the land was lotted up and boundaries were drawn. And people were given plots of land that were to stay in their family forever. And that would be different than, say, how you would provide for something in that way, how you would find justice could be different in New York City today than what the Israelites had set up from a biblical point of view. Because we got to ask ourselves, what does biblical judgment look like? What is a just society according to God? And I did find some, I feel, kind of interesting verses on this. And in Psalms, and Psalm 68, verses 3 through 5, but let the righteous be glad, let them rejoice before God. Yea, let them exceedingly rejoice, sing unto God, sing praises to his name, that rideth upon the heavens, and by his name Jehovah, and rejoice before him, a father of the fatherless, a judge of the widows, is God in his holy habitation. In Micah, we read 6:8, he that shown thee, O man, what is good, and what doth the Lord require of thee, but do it justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. In Isaiah, the first chapter of Isaiah, learn to do well, seek judgment, relieve the oppressed, judge the fatherless, plead for the widow. There's a theme going here, by the way. In Zechariah chapter 7 and verses 8 and 9, thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, execute true judgment, and show mercy and compassions every man to his brother, and oppress not the widow, nor the fatherless, the stranger, nor the poor, and let none of them imagine evil against his brother in thine heart. In Micah, and I found Micah somewhat interesting. There's a lot going on in Micah that I guess I really didn't realize. And that was, as I mentioned earlier, I think we all know that there were boundaries made. So everybody was given a plot of land. It was supposed to stay in their family. And how long was it supposed to stay in their family? Okay, but you hear about land being sold. So how did it end up in the family if it was sold? They had a year of Jubilee every 49 years. Does the Bible ever record Jubilee happening? I don't think that it does. You're saying no? It's a great concept, but I would almost think it would have this negative effect. Because say the year of Jubilee is in 20 years. And Mike wants to sell some land. He's got a field and he's in hard times and he wants to sell it to Bob, and Bob wants to buy this plot of land to make more money. And, Jubilee's 20 years away. Well, this plot of land might be worth $1,000. What if Jubilee's 2 years away? Oh, Mike gets it back in 2 years. If they did that, it'd be worth a lot less. However, if Jubilee was last year, might be worth a little bit more. But again, there's no record of it being done. But one of the things that was going on in Micah is they actually caught people moving land boundaries. And this is one of the things that Micah and God gets pretty upset about, because people would go out at night. And I suppose you couldn't move it 100 yards the first day, but, I don't know if you went out and, moved it over 10 feet, and, I don't know, waited several months and moved it another 3 or 4 feet, a few years goes by and somebody might walk out and say, man, this doesn't look right, but.
Do you see the genius in having that return every 49 years?
Yeah, it is genius.
Because what's my profit in doing that? I'm hurting me
Yeah.
in the long run if I continue to do that. And that was God's concern going into the promised land. He said, you're going to wax fat, you're going to become wealthy, and you're going to forget me. And on the other hand, the other people are going to get poor, you're going to take their land and you're going to oppress them.
That's exactly what was going on. And yeah.
And neither one of those are good. So every 49 years, we're going to reset. Because I know where this is going to end up. And it ended up because they never did reset that we know of. Maybe in extra biblical sources, but never reset as we know it. And that's why God sent them to Babylon. You weren't keeping Sabbaths, you weren't keeping, or the year of release, you weren't keeping the year of Jubilee, you weren't keeping any of that stuff. And so you're going in because of that reason.
And that was, well, then there was not just a year of Jubilee where the land went back, but there's a year of release every 7 years.
Yeah.
Or if you had
Servant.
if times got hard and Larry had to sell one of his daughters, and I don't know if I like that smile, Larry. To Mike, and every 7 years, Mike would have to give her back, and every 7 years it was a year of release. And those were things that were set in place. But yes, and do you think for a minute that if Bob over here had 12 sons, well, let's not go there. Let's say 8. He had 8 fine, young, strapping lads, and Mike over here had 2 daughters and was getting older. Do you think that if Bob over here owned a farm between these two and he wanted to go out and move a boundary, whose boundary is he going to move? He ain't going to move his. Yeah, he's going to move Mike's. Why? You're going to think that Mike probably isn't as able to defend. He's an easier target. He's by himself. He's the weaker one of the group. And that's who they're going to pick on. But in Micah, the Lord tells us, and I will come near you to judgment, and I will be a swift witness against the sorcerers, against the adulterers, against false swearers, and against those that oppress the hireling in his wages, the widow, the fatherless, and that turn aside the stranger from his right, and fear me not, saith the Lord of hosts. And it is interesting that this group of people that keeps reappearing. And Ezekiel, the last one I'm going to reference, thou become guilty in thy blood that thou hast shed, and defiled thyself and thine idols, which thou hast made, and caused thy days to draw near. Thou art even come unto thy years, for I have made thee to reproach unto the heathen, and mocking to all countries, those that be near. And those that be far from thee shall mock thee, and which art infamous and much vexed. Behold, princes of Israel, every one were in thee, but the power to shed blood. In thee have they set by light the father and mother in the midst of thee, and have dealt oppression with the stranger. In thee have vexed the fatherless and the widow. What groups keep appearing in these?
The widow, the fatherless, the orphan, and the stranger in the land. That's 3. Widow, fatherless, the poor.
The poor. And there's another title that shows up called the oppressed. And those just might be the weak.
Okay.
I'm not sure exactly. The other ones are pretty self-explanatory who they are. But these 4 groups, so in a biblical view of a just society, these are the people that society has to care for. These are the people that God says, the fatherless, the poor, the widow, the stranger, the oppressed. These are the people that if you do not only just if you take advantage of them, which would be really bad, but if you don't help them, God is calling this wrong. God is saying a just society helps the fatherless or the orphan, the poor, the widow, the stranger, and the oppressed. And these are things that you don't trample on these people's rights. Now, also keep in mind that when these laws were given, there were kings throughout Israel, but in the beginning there was no king. Israel wasn't set up to be a monarchy. It wasn't set up to have a leader that way. They were all supposed to follow God's role and God's laws and everything hovered around the temple. Judges came up when they got out of line. People started acting better, and then they go back. But these are things that were just supposed to be done with no oversight. These are the things that you, as a person in that culture, were supposed to do. And you were expected to do them. And God took a very, very dim view of you not. He also, if we look back in the Old Testament, in the law in Leviticus, there were laws set to care for these people. That things that you were not, as say, a farmer or a tenant or some other, that you were not allowed to do. In Leviticus chapter 19, and when you reap the harvest of the land, thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of the field, neither shalt thou gather the gleanings of thy harvest. Thou shalt not glean thy vineyard, neither shalt thou gather every grape in thy vineyard. Thou shalt leave them for the poor, the stranger, and stranger. I am the Lord God. In chapter 23, when you reap the harvest of the land, thou shalt not make a clean riddance of the corners of thy field. When thou reapest, neither shalt thou gather any gleaning of thy harvest. Thou shalt leave them unto the poor and the stranger. In Deuteronomy, it goes a little farther. Thou shalt remember that thou was a bondman in Egypt, and the Lord God remembered thee. Therefore I command thee to do this thing. When thou cuttest down the harvest of thy field, and thou hast forgot a sheaf in the field, thou shalt not go again to fetch it. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, for the widow, for that the Lord may bless thee in the work of thy hands. And when thou beatest the olive tree, thou shalt not go over the boughs again. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, for the widow. There, again, you're seeing these groups reappear, and some of this I found interesting. If you cut it and sheath it out in the field, like the Amish do, you see them sitting out in the field, and you clean out the field and you forget one, you're not allowed to go back and get it. You forgot it. That is for the fatherless, the stranger, the widow. Don't go back and get it. And I didn't know what beating olive trees meant either. They went through and beat the trees, literally. They would go through when the olives were about ripe. They would go through and beat the limbs of the trees and knock all the olives on the ground to gather them up. Well, the olives that weren't ripe, well, they worked on time in this. The olives that weren't ripe and didn't fall, you had to leave. Now, today, they wouldn't do that. They would go back through and do a second harvest or whatever, or pick the rest of the grapes were the same way. You went through and you picked your grapes. You didn't wait for you didn't go back through. If they all weren't ripe, you didn't go back through and get them. You left them, and they were for the stranger, for the poor, for the widow, for the oppressed, to go back, and that's how they got food. Now, today in America, that wouldn't work so well, because there's nowhere at 42nd and Wall Street in New York that somebody's going to go out and get the harvest from the field. There are, but that doesn't mean that you still don't take care of these people, would be my point. And I just find it, in the beginning, I said, what's your idea of a just society? Is it any different? When you think about it now, is a different word come to mind? Bob said fairness when we started, and we all like to be treated fair. But we have social programs today, and not just Social Security and all kinds of welfare programs, but something else I think we have to think about in these social programs: fire departments, ambulances, emergency services, hospitals, police. Did I say that one? But these are all civic servants. They're all social programs. We pay taxes to fund a library. There's all kinds of social services we have in America. And do you want to get mad, just read your tax bill on everything that you fund. And I do feel like in the end they forget who they work for. But we have civil services that come out and plow the road in front of your house, and pave it and maintain it, and they do all kinds of work. I just read that one of the states, I think it was Maine, wants to take over the electric service for the entire state. It's going to become a social program. I don't know how that's going to work, if you still get a bill or your taxes go up or something, but they're looking at redefining how the electricity is just the distribution of it in the state. And one thing that also we have to keep in mind, there was no, in ancient times, these things didn't exist. If Bob, I'll pick on Bob because there's a bunch of us, if Bob died, how does his widow get by? There's no food stamps, you don't get his Social Security. Excuse me. There was no safety net for these people. And it's one of the things that made Christianity, people really looked at it, especially in like the Roman Empire. Because you read how, from the introduction of Christianity to Christianity taking over the Roman Empire, really, in the grand scheme of things, didn't last that long, considering how deeply their beliefs were held. And but these safety nets for people just didn't exist. There wasn't anything. And there is one, excuse me, one fun fact I'm going to close with. The one uniquely Christian contribution to history is the hospital. And I got that from several sources on the internet. As I say, it has to be true. But that's a totally Christian concept. Nobody had hospitals. There was no place. There was a doctor that would come, but that was it. And I thought that was kind of neat. So I would ask at the end, a just society. I hope maybe some different words come to your mind than they did at the beginning.